What is up, my fitness nerds? My name is Amir. If you haven't been here before, I'm a chemical engineer and an evidence-based trainer. And today we are going to dissect the question of, should you train to failure if you want to optimize muscle growth? And I wish the answer were yes or no, because then I can make this video 30 seconds, less work for me, more value to you, and we can be on our merry way. But it's not, and it requires a lot more context. So that's what this video is aimed to do. It's aimed for, first of all, for you to walk away with an answer for yourself, but also to give you an understanding of how deep down the rabbit hole this goes and why it's not a simple answer. So if anybody online is like, you should train to failure every set, or you should never train to failure, then they don't really know what they're talking about because of all these things that I'm about to discuss. So let's jump right in. To answer this question, we're gonna look at three different types of evidence. The first being physiological or mechanistic evidence. So what's going on down at the biomolecular level that can explain the results or explain what happens downstream of it. Then we are going to take a look at the actual studies that, put people in a gym at varying degrees of intensity, training intensity, and what they observed with that. Then lastly, we're going to look at real world anecdotal evidence and then tie it all together with applicability in the real world, because theory means nothing if you can't actually apply it in a gym setting. The first thing we're going to do is bang out the stimulating reps model. And essentially what it states is that in the last 4 to 6 reps of any set taken to failure is where the muscle growth stimulus occurs. So this is taken in the context of a single set taken to failure, and it's saying that about the last 5 reps are all that count towards muscle growth. Now, what is actually happening? This is a sidetrack, but what's actually happening during those last 5 reps? Well, we have very high degrees of motor unit recruitment, which is very closely correlated with effort, but there's a lot of other things going on there. Okay, and then we have a slowing down of the contraction speed. So a slow contraction velocity and high degrees of motor unit recruitment. And the slow contraction speed basically means that forces on a single muscle fiber are very high due to the relationship or the force velocity curve. Force velocity relationship, whatever you want to call it. But essentially, as we're moving slower, single fiber force is very high. And then what high degrees of motor unit recruitment means is that all of those muscle fibers are moving slowly and experiencing high degrees of force. So this is a very important distinction to make, because if you are intentionally moving slow, being like, I'm getting more mechanical tension, then your motor unit recruitment is not going to be very high. Because let's say this phone, for example, right? I'm not moving as fast as I can with this phone, so my motor unit recruitment is fairly low in this movement. I'm only using as many muscle fibers as I need. Now, if I maxed out motor unit recruitment, I would yeet this thing into a different dimension, okay? It would just go flying, right? So it has to be an involuntary slowing down of the contraction speed. So intentionally going slow, especially on the concentric, is not going to produce any more stimulus. All right, now, to take this into an example of a biceps curl, let's say we're curling 40-pound dumbbells and, big guys, right? And we know that we're going to fail at 10 reps. Okay, if we did all 10 reps and hit failure, then we got 5 of those stimulating reps. Now let's say if we stopped at 9 reps, then we only got 4 of those stimulating reps. If we stopped at 8 reps, we got 3 stimulating reps. If we stopped at 7 reps, we got 2 stimulating reps. And if we stopped at 5 reps, we got almost no stimulating reps. Again, the range is 4 to 6, but it's a model that tracks really well, actually. Okay, so stopping before failure, the further away from failure you get, the less stimulating reps you achieve, which means the less muscle growth stimulus that you will end up having. Okay, so if we were to just look at this, we'd be like, yeah, train to failure. What are you doing, right? But this is limited because it's taken in the context of a single set taken to failure, right? As soon as we start stacking sets on top of each other, the stimulating reps model changes, right? Because fatigue enters the equation, and fatigue is a monster of a subject, so we're going to briefly touch on it. When I refer to fatigue, I'm not just talking about the normal sense of the word, which is being tired. I'm talking about the exercise science definition, which is a temporary and reversible reduction in exercise performance caused by a previous bout of exercise. So you do an exercise, right? You do a set, fatigue mechanisms are at play, and that reduces the performance of your next set, depending on a bunch of different variables. Okay, but that's what fatigue is. Okay, and there's going to be two main types of fatigue. There is central nervous system fatigue, which happens within the brain and then the spinal cord, and then there is peripheral fatigue, which happens within the muscles themselves. Now, for the context of this conversation, I want to talk about one specific type of fatigue mechanism that is like almost a game ender, which is called excitation contraction coupling failure. Now, there is a lot of words there, but we're going to break it down. When we want to stimulate a contraction to happen, we have this electrical signal that travels from our brain through our spinal cord, across the muscle fiber, down a transverse tubule, and it eventually reaches the triadic junction, okay? And then this electrical signal, it's called a triadic junction because there's three sides, okay? This electrical signal, it will meet the voltage sensor. A signal gets passed through the minor triadic proteins, and then this electrical signal is then converted into a chemical signal on the other side, which stimulates the release of calcium ions into the cytoplasm. And when calcium ions are dropped into the cytoplasm, that essentially triggers myosin heads to start attaching to actin and then actually pulling, which is the muscle fiber actually contracting. That's known as the sliding filament theory. Okay, so calcium ions are necessary to cause muscular contractions. However, when you get too many calcium ions built up within the cytoplasm, you run into a lot of different issues. The main one being excitation contraction coupling failure. Now, our body is actually very poor at removing excess calcium ions from the cytoplasm. So, initially, we have our mitochondria, which can act as buffers and be like, hey, I'll take some of those guys in to clear it out. But as soon as those become fully saturated, we just start building, assuming we continue our contractions, we continue doing sets, reps, whatever. We start getting a rapid buildup of calcium ions. Okay, and when that happens, these proteases called calpains essentially get released, and like mini Pac-Men, they start degrading a bunch of different protein structures. And the one structure they degrade specifically that is annoying is that, going back to this minor the triadic junction, it degrades the minor triadic proteins. So it's basically flipping open the circuit breaker, and we are not going to be able to contract that muscle fiber anymore, which is very problematic if we're trying to stimulate growth, because if we can't activate the muscle fiber, then it cannot experience mechanical tension. So this type of fatigue mechanism we really want to avoid. So to summarize all of that, calcium ion accumulation, bad, because it causes excitation contraction coupling failure, which is a damaging mechanism. So we cannot turn that muscle fiber back on until that damage is repaired, which does not happen within the workout itself. It happens in the post-workout period, on the order of days. Now let's revisit the stimulating reps model, and let's just talk about one single set. Let's forget about all the other sets, okay? Now, calcium ion accumulation is not linear in nature. It doesn't develop linearly, like on rep 1, let's say if we have a 10 rep set, it's not like you get 10% of the calcium ion accumulation each rep. It is more exponential in nature. So towards the end of the set, you get a lot more calcium ion accumulation, okay? So specifically, those last couple of reps, it really does spike up, especially within the last rep of failure, okay? So that kind of begs the question, maybe we can settle for 4 out of the 5 stimulating reps, get 80% of the stimulus, and shave that last rep off, maybe even the last 2 reps off, okay? So that we can mitigate fatigue on our next set. So we can keep that circuit breaker nice and operational, so that on that next set, we can go back and get more stimulating reps for all of the muscle fibers and have an overall effective workout. Now that was a lot of words and theory, but does it actually play out in the outcome data where we take people, put them through a resistance training program, and see what happens? Okay, now there are several studies and meta-analyses taking a look at this subject. Before we jump into the outcome data, I want to hammer on calcium ion accumulation for just a second. Okay, so it's not only determined by the proximity to failure, reps in reserve, it's also determined by things like exercise selection. Are we doing a lengthened position exercise versus a contracted position exercise? How long are our rest periods? And how many total sets are we doing? Because the more sets you're doing, the more calcium ion related fatigue you're gonna get. And the more stretch position, same thing. Shorter rest periods, same thing. And how many reps within a set are we doing? Same thing. Higher reps, more fatiguing. So we have to kind of juggle all of these different variables, and I'll call them confounding variables within these studies in order to kind of make sense of it. All right, because if you have wildly different exercise set or workout setups between these studies, you can end up with different results or a different answer. Okay, so taking all of these things into account, we have several studies that indicate different things. I'm going to butcher this guy's name, but Gergic et al. In this study in 2022 showed a slight edge for failure in trained individuals. All right, and then we have Rafalo et al. In 2024 that shows that 1 to 2 reps in reserve has a similar growth as compared to failure, and then they have less fatigue as well. And then we have Pelland in 2024, which shows a dose response effect that growth improves as you get closer to failure. So, and you have a lot of other studies looking at this as well, but what we can kind of derive from this, because there are so many different variables between these studies, is like, it just seems to be that the closer you get to failure, somewhere between 0 to 3 RIR, the better muscle growth outcomes you achieve. That's what the studies basically all line up on. They can mostly agree on that. All right, and that actually works out really well and lines up really well with our mechanistic argument using the stimulating reps model and our model for how fatigue works. Okay, so a lot of the inconsistencies between those studies make sense when you consider all of the different variables that we talked about. So we've discussed theories and mechanisms, we've discussed studies, and now we will discuss what happens in the real world, which I'm pretty sure is the most important part of this whole thing, considering that we all work out in the real world. All right? So across the board, coaches and gym veterans alike will all agree on the fact that training close to failure and those who train closest to failure end up with the best results, hands down, every single time. All right, that's indisputable. So in terms of the exact proximity to failure, whether we actually go all the way to failure or maybe stop 1 rep shy of failure, which by the way is still very, very, very difficult, okay, changes based on the individuals and the programming. What I've found in my professional experience and the way that I program is that 1 rep in reserve is the absolute sweet spot. But there's a big asterisk on that. It's for the way that I program for myself and my clients. So we generally do a lower volume approach with lower numbers of reps per set. We have very careful exercise selection. And then also we're taking long rest periods. So with all of that, 1 rep in reserve ends up being the exact sweet spot, but it might not be for you with your programming, okay? So here are the steps I would take to figure out what the answer is for you. The first step, know what failure looks like. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you have never trained to failure, then how do you know what 1 rep in reserve or 2 reps in reserve even is, right? Because failure is the reference point. So being able to train to failure with good form is a prerequisite to even having this discussion. Because if you've never trained to failure, how do you know what 1 rep in reserve is? Now for the experimentation part of things, all right? So you're gonna create an exercise program and you're gonna do the same thing week in, week out. Now, for the first 2 months, we're not gonna look at any of that data in terms of our strength progression. And that's what we're gonna be tracking, how much stronger you're getting. That is the key variable, okay? So for the first 2 months of any new program, a lot of the adaptations you're gonna get are neural adaptations, meaning that they are related to your central nervous system, okay? So essentially you are getting more efficient at doing the movement patterns, and those strength increases are not necessarily indicative of muscle growth across the board. Like, yes, you are likely experiencing muscle growth, but we also have all these other factors at play. So that kind of levels out the neural adaptations after the first couple of months. By and large, it stabilizes, okay? So after that first couple of month period is when we're gonna start collecting data, okay? And then so on month 3, you're gonna run the entirety of month 3, train to failure, okay? Log your strength, see how things go, and then the next month, train at 1 rep in reserve for all of your sets. And then the following month, train at 2 reps in reserve for all of your sets, okay? And you will then compare the data, go back and be like, oh, I got a lot stronger, a lot faster with 1 rep in reserve for my training program. Or maybe it's 2 for you, or maybe it's failure, okay? But the only way to find out is for you to go and test these things. And by the way, if you think running a program for 4 or 5 months is a long time that you're not gonna get results out of it, that's just not the case. I've ran programs for the better part of a year straight and continuously made progress through it. And it's honestly the best idea to stick with a program for at least a few months in the first place anyways, okay? So that's how you're gonna find out exactly what rep and reserve range works best for you. There is no black and white answer, but this should help you achieve the muscle growth outcomes that you're looking to achieve. And if you don't feel like doing 4 or 5 months of experimentation to find this out for yourself, then I've already done it, okay? So there's gonna be a link somewhere here. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one, we can go ahead and do that. And if not, I hope this video helped you and have a blessed day. Peace.